a quorum. We have all members that we were expecting present. So we're ready to start whenever you're ready.
The only one today is part 2 of the merger.
Well, and thank you, Ellen. And I apologize if there's any background. I hear somebody talking. So let's start off with a little kind of overview. If you're not talking, you could have be on mute. I joined just in time for Trustee Doak's money run with the weddings coming up. I'm sorry, I was on a different link. Let's jump right in and get started with the FY 2022 proposed operating budget first reading.
Trustee Donnelly, we need to do roll call.
And first we'll do roll call. Ellen, if you would do roll call, please.
Certainly, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Trustee Kane.
Here.
Trustee Doak. Trustee Doak, you must be on mute. We'll come back to him. Trustee Donnelly.
Here.
Trustee Gardner.
Here.
Trustee McMahon.
Here.
Trustee Martin.
Here.
Trustee Riley.
Here.
Trustee Rotundo.
Here.
Trustee Doak, we could see you. Can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. I got 3 screens and my mouse isn't going quicker than I am, so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We're all set, Trustee Donnelly.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you for the reminder on our protocols. I'll get that down eventually. 2 or 3 years from now, you'll have me well trained. First up, we have FY 22 operating budget in the first reading, but just for level set over the what we're planning on doing, hoping to do today is do a little time with the Gordian report and have Chip and Ryan walk us through where we are, what progress has been made over time, and any plans there are coming up. And then we're going to go through the campus budget. We've had the first run through in FFT meeting for any updates. We'll have the campuses walk us through, and then we'll slide into an executive session later and have any conversations that we need to have. And so I think it'll be a couple of hours, and I think we'll fly right through it. So with that, Vice Chancellor Lowe, would you take over the proposed operating budget in the first reading?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to jump right into, as the chair said, kind of 2 pieces, a couple of different pieces that we'll talk about this morning. We'll start with the Gordian sightlines report, and then work our way back to the for the budget for the last of the public conversation on that. And so let me pull up my screen. And hopefully everyone can see that now. So let me first thank the chair for kind of teeing up this extra conversation. I think, as we've talked about with the trustees, we would typically have the March presentations that we did, and we'd flow right into the May meeting, where we would be looking for this committee's endorsement of the budget. And so appreciate the chair calling really an extra meeting, just to allow the trustees an opportunity to digest a full day of March meetings, and give myself as well as my system colleagues an opportunity to answer any questions that you might have. As I said, I was going to start with the facilities piece. So let me first thank. I want to thank a few people. I want to thank the Chancellor for kind of really encouraging us to focus in on facilities. We've been going through and seeing these Gordian sightline reports for more than a decade now. We typically have some really good conversations, and we try to make some progress. And I think the reports show that we're making progress, but our definition of progress has been, holding steady, not declining as much as we have in the past. Really difficult to really move the needle, and so the chancellor challenged us to put together a plan that could actually do that, and I think we've got a good proposal to talk about this morning, and hopefully enact over the next several months. So we're excited about that. I want to thank Chip Gavin and Carolyn McDonough, who really lead these efforts on a day-to-day basis with the facilities directors across the system, and also want to thank the presidents and the campuses. It's not easy to prioritize roof repairs and facilities. The chancellor was in Presque Isle yesterday, and so I sat in on a call of other higher ed leaders, across the country. And this was the conversation they were having. They were all talking about the sorry state of their facilities. They were all talking about how challenging it is when you get down to it. If most of our budgets across higher education are 70, 80% people, and it's much easier to prioritize people over buildings, and maybe that's the right thing to do. But when you do it decade after decade after decade, you get some of the results that the Gordian data shows that we have on our campuses. So the agenda for at least the facilities portion of the conversation is just want to talk really briefly about kind of the status of construction across the system and the number of projects that we have, and how we're gonna keep trustees up with that. And then, as I said, want to follow up with some specific action plan around the Gordian report that we feel can maybe move the needle a little bit more than we have in the past. So I'll just note here that if I work for myself from left to right on this chart, on the left you see the capital project status report. That is a document that Carolyn shares with this committee and all of your regular meetings. It is a detailed snapshot, if you will, of the projects that are going on across the system, when they started, what the budgeted amount was, and funding status, and so on. We've also, the board has approved a number of large projects recently. At your last meeting, you approved the Career and Student Center, the Residence Hall at the University of Southern Maine. I think in January, you approved a really large energy project at the University of Maine. We talked at this group's last meeting about exciting P3 opportunities in our residence halls at Farmington, at Presque Isle. Really just looking at all of the different opportunities that we have out there. And then finally, the really exciting opportunities we have as part of the Harold Alfond grant and the opportunities that exist there. But it's a lot to keep track of. It's a lot for us to keep track of, and it's certainly a lot for board members who are coming in and out to be able to understand, what are the projects that we're thinking about, what are the projects that we're actively involved in, that whole kind of scale, that whole spectrum of where projects could be. And so to address that, spend some time brainstorming with Chair Donnelly. And then working with both Chip and Carolyn, Sharon Buchanan in our office, and tried to come up with an easy to follow visual of all of the capital projects that we have across the system at various stages. Those, again, like the P3s that we talked about at Farmington and Presque Isle, that are still really in that super early stage, to the planning stage, the construction stage, maybe even the demo stage. And the thinking was, if we could put this in a couple of pieces of paper by campus, color coded, it really does give you a good sense of project timelines, estimated project costs, the number of projects that we've got going on each of the individual campuses. So again, the hope is by giving you a little bit more information over a longer window of time in a way that's easier to follow, that both trustees and as well as the system and campus administration can present these to our campus community, to the trustees in a way that everyone can understand all of the exciting projects that we have going on across the system. So I'll just note this is still in a little bit of draft stage where we're making sure that we've got everything that we want in here. We're trying to decide which projects make sense, including here. You know, does a roofing job, does that make sense to put on here? Or do we really just want, you know, those big projects that trustees you know, are going to want you know, quick access to understand where they are. So a little bit more work on this left, but we hope it's a document that you'll find useful as you try to align kind of all of these moving parts. So that was about it I was going to mention on this. Happy to take any questions, but again, the goal was to really just take some of the information that we're already giving you, but we're giving it to you in 7 or 8 different ways, and trying to put it in one place to make it a little bit easier to follow. And hopefully we hit the mark on that one.
I'll just hop in and say the brainstorming was me telling Ryan that it was hard for me to keep all of these things and how they overlap organized in a way that I could see what was going to happen when there were gaps in between. And then through Ryan and Chip fashion and their teams, I think it was an hour or 2 later, the first iteration appeared on my computer. So thank you to Ryan and Chip and team for taking a suggestion and making it workable. And I think hopefully for all of us and the trustees with historic amounts of investment going into this campus is a great way for us to keep track of what's happening where and what at the same time and what all the moving parts are. I know it's amazing what they're able to keep on top of their head, but it certainly wasn't rolling off my tongue easily without this tool. So hopefully all of the trustees find their good work as helpful as I found it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So going to move on to the again the action plan that the chancellor charged us with coming back to him and ultimately bringing to the trustees. So this is that annual time of year, that January to March window. Shortly after we've received our Gordian Sightline report on the status of our facilities, that it's really depressing. That you know, at times it feels like the problems and the challenges are so big that we can't make any progress. And so this year, again, as I've noted, we worked on a plan, kind of a 3-part plan to really try to see if we couldn't make some progress, to see if we couldn't move the needle on some of these numbers. And so I'm just going to spend a few minutes walking through our plan. So the first one, and clearly one of the most important, is our annual budgeting commitment to facilities. All of you that sat through the March presentations, you saw this Sightline slide that we've been showing for a number of years, that has this band going across the middle that acknowledges this is the minimum amount you need to be investing without losing ground, and it's this Goldilocks zone, as Chip calls it. And if you're not investing in there, then you're going backwards. And you have to really look hard at the data over the last 10 years to find 1 or 2 examples of a campus hitting that minimum threshold. We are consistently well below that threshold. The only times we typically even get close are when we have a large one-time infusion of resources, typically from a bond package, and we might get within sight of that minimum investment, but typically we're well below what that number is. We've tried a number of strategies in my 11 years with the system now. We've tried to set specific funding percentages of depreciation. So by next year, all the campuses are going to be at 80%, and then they're going to be at 85%. And by 2014, we're going to be at 100% across all of our campuses. And it's 7 years after we set that target, and we're not anywhere near that. What typically happens is we set those goals and they make absolute sense, but campuses are so far away from them. We typically lose ground each year. It becomes something like the $1 billion in deferred maintenance, that it's such a large number that it's really just difficult to get your arms around. And so a few years ago, we shifted the strategy and instead tried to focus on what are the campuses spending in their base budget on facilities today? And then what about if we focus in on that number and we have each campus increase it by 3% in 1 year, 3.5% for the next year until we get up to 5%. And then we're looking for minimum consistent 5% increases in what campuses are spending. And so we've done that for a number of years. You don't get progress overnight because a 3% increase on a really small number is an even smaller number. But if we can get those base budgets up to a decent amount, and then can start looking for those consistent increases, we do think it's a space where we can be making some progress. So for fiscal year 22, we started out with that FY21 base budget number. And then I think, as we've talked about before, the governor's 2022-23 budget flat funds higher ed, but it flat funds us at what we call pre-curtailment levels. So in fiscal year 21, we had an appropriation. It was reduced by about 2.2 million as part of a curtailment. And we moved on with the FY21 budget. When the governor flat funded 22 and 23, essentially that curtailment was restored. And so for the campuses, the system absorbed more than half of that curtailment, about 60% of that curtailment. But that restoration meant that after we had done the initial budget drafts, at least, we had another $1 million that came back to the campuses through that curtailment. So working with the chancellor, working with the presidents, we agreed that those new dollars, if you will, would all be put back into facilities. So we, across the system, we plowed about an extra $1 million into those FY21 base budgets. And then we increased that number by an additional 5%. So the short-term result is a 20% increase in capital investment in the FY22 budget over our FY21 numbers. As you can see, we're now funding, if this budget is approved, 67% of the depreciation expenses across the system. That is up 12% over our FY21 numbers. And I think just as important is that these new commitments now, including the pre-curtailment amount, the $1 million, will now be part of the base budget when we go into FY23, and we'll look to again increase that number by another 5%. So feel really good about where we are. Both by the numbers that you see here, and then again, based on the phone call I had yesterday with others that are clearly struggling in this space. So nice to see some progress here. We need to make sure that progress sticks, however. And what I'll note is that we've historically had, not exclusively, but we've had a disconnect between what we budget and what we actually spend in facilities on some of our campuses, just based on changing budget circumstances. So, you think you're going to spend this at the beginning of the year, you get into the spring, you're running a budget deficit. Boy, it's much easier to come here than it is to some other lines. And so we see folks backing off that budgeted amount. It's not consistent. It's not every campus. It's not every year. We have some stars out there, and I used Fort Kent as an example yesterday when I was talking with the CBOs. Fort Kent typically budgets a certain amount, and in almost every case, their actual spending is more than that. They get to the end of the year, they've got some resources, they plow those back into facilities, and certainly appreciate that effort. But we have other examples where, campuses in recent years have budgeted high six-figure increases in spending and capital investment. And by the end of the year, when you look at the actuals, it's in the low five figures. It's in the 10 to 20,000 range after budgeting as much as 800,000. And so that's a disconnect. It's a disconnect between what we put in the budget. It's a disconnect between what you approve for a budget. And so the second piece of our plan is around some policy change that would simply require that dollars budgeted for capital need to be spent on capital investments. Makes sense, but we think it makes sense to put it in policy. Any dollars that are left at the end of the year, and it's not unusual for dollars to be left. I think all of you, understand these projects are typically multiple years, and so even if you set aside some resources, maybe it takes multiple years to spend it. We do a lot of our work in the summertime, so maybe after the fiscal year is closed. And so what we'll commit to is any resources that are left at the end of the year would be transferred out and moved into a capital reserve account. And then our current policy already says that capital reserve dollars need to be spent on capital unless the treasurer approves, a different plan. So again, not a huge issue, but it has created some differences between budget and actuals. And so we think this policy change is another step in the right direction. And then finally, the final part of our plan is focused on space reduction. We all know we have limited assets to spend on our facilities. So let's not waste them spending those dollars on vacant space. And so since we started the partnership with Sightlines more than a decade ago, we annually identify space that is not essential to our campus missions, high cost, low use. So if it makes sense, those projects should be considered for demolition. And we've made progress in this space. The system has removed dozens of buildings over the last decade, representing more than 100,000 square feet of space. Some of our campuses like UMA, like Fort Kent, have been particularly aggressive when it comes to space removal. So, when we talk about the state of our facilities, we often note that we're in this stage where the projects pick us, where we can't be as planful as we want to be. And it goes without saying, but we never want to get to the point where the demo projects are picking us. Several of you will recall that the system was forced to close Kimball Hall at the University of Maine in Machias back in 2015, when that building, which was occupied at the time, was determined to be structurally unsound and in danger of collapse. The building was evacuated and then torn down about a year later. So again, this is an area, it goes without saying, that we just need to be on top of. We've funded a line item in our budget for demolition projects in recent years, relying on the great work of our Capital Budget Advisory Committee to review and recommend projects for that. Our recent work, you can see here at the bottom of this slide, for 2020-21 has targeted an additional 24 buildings, about 68,000 gross square feet of space. These are some of the demo projects over the last several years across the system. Here you see the project that I referenced at Machias, Kimball Hall, project at the University of Maine, and then a fairly recent project of what's going on at USM now, the Woodbury Center, or where the Woodbury Center at least used to be there. The big challenge here is that demolitions, it costs a lot of money to tear down a building. And I think you all understand as well as anyone, a lot of our campuses do not have a lot of excess resources. And so, imagine a scenario where you've got 2 or 3 million tucked away in reserves. It took you several years to get there. Do you spend it all to tear down a building that's costing you $30,000, $40,000 a year to heat or some other number? You'd like to think the answer is yes, but sometimes the circumstances dictate that you keep those resources. And so for 2023, one of the things that we're putting in front of you today is that we would use a combination of the existing funds, the annual commitment that we have to debt service, in addition to some freed up debt service that we have that will be coming off the books in 22, and use that. It's about 1.6 million to support a system-wide demolition bond. We can use that annual commitment to support a revenue bond of somewhere around $15 million, less some issuance costs. With that $15 million investment and some matching funds that would come from campuses that have bigger projects, we really do think that we could make a substantial amount of progress on building demolition. We've talked about it before. We've got more than 550 buildings across the system. We think what this would do potentially, and I want to emphasize again, it's in draft stage. We have committees that we would want to work through, campuses that we would want to work through. But just looking at the list that we have, we could quickly target at least 63 buildings, more than 550,000 square feet of space. As noted here, the average net asset value of those buildings targeted is 40%. Several of them have no asset value. And then, one of the really big benefits here, as you can see, is eliminating nearly 70 or more than $70 million of investment that would otherwise be needed in those facilities. So I think that gets me to this final slide, which again is what is next. These are some of the projects that we have we kind of have targeted potentially for the next round. But again, we would just want to kind of work through that with all of the appropriate committees. So I don't want to do anything just final yet on that, but that does give you an idea of the plan that we're working on. So I think I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to put Chip on the spot and see if there is anything that Chip would like to add to that for context, and then happy to answer any questions.
No, I think that's a great summary, Ryan. Maybe the only supplemental point I might make is that the trustees' support for constraining space for the past decade, even as we aspire to have new buildings and improve net asset value in that way as well, your support for making sure that we're not putting up new without contemplating taking down old has been critical to the ability to make sure this problem didn't get worse than it already has. So we appreciate that support and looking forward to working with you and with Ryan and Carolyn and other colleagues to move this forward.
Thanks, Chip. And let me just see if there's anything the Chancellor wants to add. And then again, as I said, we're happy to take questions.
It's the report I was hoping for. I think making sure that money is carried from year to year that's unspent is key to our future in regards to this particular issue. Understanding that costs may be delayed temporarily, but not permanently. And so I'm very happy with the plan as it's coming forward. We do have a lot of buildings that we're spending money on maintaining that are not used at all or extremely underutilized. It's time to get those off the books and stop heating them or repairing them or watching them decline and cause potential harm. So this is the direction that I think we need to go. And I think we need to steady the ship with respect to increasing the amounts of money going into infrastructure on a regular basis. It is jarring to think about the fact that we would spend money to demolish, but it will be impossible to make the kinds of progress that we need against measurable standards without that, and it will have a positive operating cost reaction as well. So great job, Ryan. We have ways to go, and obviously our hope is, as we work through a committee structure, that these proposals get stronger and better. And so I would also note that aspiration.
So with that, Mr. Chair, I think we're happy to answer any questions if there are any from trustees.
Thank you, Chancellor, Vice Chancellor, and Chip. Any questions from the trustees?
Yep.
Trustee Bates.
Thanks. I'm not actually a committee member, I don't think, but thanks for letting me sit in and learning a lot here. Just one question, Ryan, about the bond you're talking about, the $15 million revenue bond. To be paid back for revenue from what?
Yeah, I mean, so it's essentially revenue from our existing resources. So it's a little different than typically when the system does revenue bonds. There's literally this new revenue stream that's coming in to pay it. So student dorms are the perfect example of that. Right. In this case, the revenue bond would essentially just be paid from our E&G, our education in general. That's our tuition and state appropriation line. So it's really just us earmarking 1.6 million in our budget that would be committed to debt service.
Thanks.
Yep.
Any other questions of trustees? Trustee Riley.
Thanks. This is, I can't believe how excited Ryan is, and I am too, about tearing down buildings and dealing with deferred maintenance, but there's nothing more visual than buildings coming down to remind us of how important deferred maintenance is. So this is great progress. The only question I have is, can we get to a point, obviously the next bonding is around these demolitions. I'm struck by the need for a plan for future investments. So the board will be confronted with the P3 and the two smaller campuses. There's an arts project there, and I keep thinking about the sightlines findings that were pretty stunning. And I'm reminded of Glenn's comments about having good dorms helps with retention. And I'm struck by the humane dorms all being on the list of old and in need of repair. So how do we make the decision? How do we have a set of criteria as a board to make the decisions about which project should go forward and which shouldn't? And it's both, I think, a political visual about what we're investing in, but also a really important focus on priorities.
I'll let Ryan go first, but I'd also like to comment on that as well when you're done, Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly invite Chip to jump in as well. I think one of the things that will help that conversation, I don't know that it answers it completely, is that when we come back to this committee in May, we will come back as part of the budget approval process with our capital plans. So in May, you're going to see the 1-year capital plans. You'll see the 5 and 10-year capital plans. And so you'll see the specific details of how the campuses have prioritized those projects on their campuses, what we're thinking about for funding sources. We had a great conversation at one of our recent CBO meetings where the team from Presque Isle and Farmington shared with others how the P3 was at least working on their campuses so far. They learned a lot from the work that we did, a lot of the pre-work that we did at USM. So really just a lot of sharing, and as the chancellor challenged us early on, let's look for let's look for some unconventional ways to make progress here. And so we've gone outside the box a little bit of our traditional, narrow focus on bonds. We've looked at P3 opportunities. We've looked at revenue bonding opportunities. We've looked at what we could do in the E&G budget. And I think all of this has been, I think probably at an upcoming meeting, we're not quite ready for prime time yet, but we recently, Gordian and Sightlines recently signed a contract with the two other higher eds along with state government. So we think that when we can come back, I'm excited to come back and talk about some of those findings. But I think now that we all have, you think about all of the folks that are lining up for facilities bonding, either the Government Facilities Authority or geo bonding in higher education in the state, the ability of all of us to go in and have one data set to measure buildings equally across all of our facilities, I think is going to be helpful for policymakers. And I will say, looking at the data, it's going to be helpful to us because our facilities are by far in the worst shape of that group. But more to come on that. But I think a lot of those questions are going to be answered as part of the 1- and 5-year capital plans.
Chip, would you like?
If I could just join that brief conversation, Chair.
I was going to ask you to back clean up, but you can hop in now if you like.
Okay. What I would also say is that we do have other exciting opportunities, not the least of which is the Alfond monies against which we have to raise money. And a fair amount of that is in the capital arena. I would also tell you that honestly, even when I was interviewing for the position that the trustees ultimately gave me, I was concerned about this issue and particularly the impact on our housing revenue by not being competitive in the marketplaces that we were in, not being competitive for a couple of different reasons. First and foremost, I would say that our housing opportunities are not meeting the standard of our competition. And I think we should not include housing on any tours that we give a potential freshman. So we need to change that and change it rapidly. And I think we'll be speaking about that. And obviously that is the 3P private-public partnership opportunity that we want to maximize along with the Alfond investment. And we are actively working on all of that and will be making additional presentations. You're kind of getting an early look at some of the early steps we're taking, but we will lay out additional steps. I also believe that we've got to make some long-term decisions about staggering those investments, how they're staggered. And I think we should look toward revenue justification in prioritizing at least some of those projects. Housing would be one. Additional academic buildings that are tied to increases in population and our competitive nature, our competitive status, should receive additional highlights. So. And then I also think that we're going to have to put some pressure as we move forward, as is required by the Alfond money as well, on growth in our foundation and fundraising. So this is, Trustee Riley, this is a work in progress, but we're relatively excited about the early progress that we're bringing about.
Thank you, Chancellor. Chip, any additional comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only additional thing I might mention is for the benefit of perhaps newer trustees is that much of what you're seeing today and in hearing and talking about is the result of a lot of prior work by prior boards and staff. This is not this forward-looking approach and this commitment to investment and the good dialogue that you're all having. It wasn't always the way that that capital was talked about in the University of Maine system. So there wasn't so long ago that the annual Sightlines report or the Gordian report was sort of an after-the-fact report, but with the support of trustees and the chancellor and others, moved all of that sort of forward with your support and at your request, really, so that you do now see 1 year, 5-year capital plans every year, that you do get to see and specifically talk about and approve capital budget for the coming year. And your question, Trustee Riley, how do we do even more and be more forward-looking, be more planful? I think it's a perfectly logical and makes my heart go pitter-patter a little bit. Next step for what we aspire to, and it's a logical progression to me. And just wanted to thank everybody for the work it took to get here. That would have been an unthinkable question not that long ago. So thank you.
Thank you, Chip. Trustee King?
Thank you. I have a couple of probably more technical questions, but this is excellent work. The first question I have is, many of our campuses, I think, at least some of them, have buildings that are historical in nature, have historic significance, or on the historic register. How do the standards of those, and those are most often very beautiful, right, and sort of campus defining buildings. How does this approach intersect with requirements around that?
Would you like me to jump in on that one, Ryan?
Please.
I'll jump
Yep.
in, and I'm glad to look to Carolyn McDonough too to supplement anything I might say here. So a couple of things. A, you're correct, Trustee Kane, that we have a number of historic buildings across the system. Two, we do have specific policies and protocols around historic structures so that we don't inadvertently take action that we should not. It hasn't always been the smoothest thing, so we did change policies and practices probably a half a dozen years ago to make it more clear and make more clear responsibilities that we treat historic structures appropriately, and we certainly treasure them. And chief among those things is that the policy and practices require us to work in close collaboration, with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and for our architects and engineers to do that as well. So there is no prohibition on the owner of a historic structure actually removing a historic structure, and it is not completely unheard of for us, with your support, to actually remove a historic structure if it's just beyond salvaging in some way. That said, we work very hard to preserve them and have won historic preservation awards in the past few years for work at some of our structures, have moved and relocated historic structures to avoid having to demolish them. We have a 3P going on right now with an important historic structure, which was a novel way to try to save it. So we do pay a lot of attention to that, but it's not that they can't, if that's really warranted, be taken down, if that really is in the best interest of the university. But we are compelled and want to work with the Historic Preservation Commission to do that.
Great, thank you very much. My next question is, I'm looking at my Diligent on my other screen, about the proposed policy change about all dollars budgeted for capital must be spent on capital investments. And I think that's a really great idea. I think it's a really good intention. And then I think about all the other categories of spending that we change around during the course of a budget out of necessity because things happen during a year. And I'm imagining conversations with faculty about all money spent that's allocated for academics should be spent on academics, and all money that should be spent on the arts should be spent on the arts. And I guess I'm not against the prioritization of capital in the budget. I'm just, because I know this policy is going to go through the different committees and there'll be a lot of conversation about it. But I think there's a difference between obviously money that comes in for capital, that is allocated for capital, staying with capital, prioritizing deferred maintenance and things like that. I'm just anticipating conversations of like, well, you're doing it there. Why are you taking my money that was budgeted for academics and moving it to something else? So or you could even get more specific, engineering to engineering or English to English. I just want to throw that out there from a budgeting perspective of flexibility isn't always bad if priorities are clear. So.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think we look forward to the policy discussion. I think the reason why we looked at that as an option here is because there was such a variance between actuals and budget. I don't think you see that in academics. I don't think you see that in a lot of other areas where you have, and again, the example I used isn't, it doesn't happen all the time, but when you budget $1 million and you spend 15,000, that's a pretty big gap. And so we do have safeguards built in there. Campuses the treasurer has authority working with the campus to shift resources back if there is a higher and better use. But I think it makes sense in this case, but completely understand your point and certainly look forward to the conversations there. And we can talk about a little bit of the data in different areas as well.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions of trustees?
I just want to comment on Trustee Kane's very appropriate question. We pay most of our bills by the month or by the week. We don't pay our bills on capital investment that way. And there is a distinct difference. And the proof of that difference is that we've allowed this gap to grow larger and larger and larger. And so I do think there's a justifiable distinction, not just based on history, but for instance, we're legally obligated to pay our bills and to honor our contracts. We don't have that relationship with respect to capital investment. And that's why capital investment accounts have routinely been used to balance yearly budgets. The problem with that is that we then owe more money and still don't pay it by the week or by the month or by the schedule. So I think I could handle that argument.
It's really a helpful perspective, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? I'll just throw out that a couple of the comments. When I got on the board, there was one trustee who asked every time somebody was going to hang a picture on the wall, what picture we were taking down to make sure we weren't adding square footage that we couldn't handle. And so that position's open on the board if anybody wants to take that role. As Chip remembers, well, we might call that the Turner comments. But it's we can, in my short time here, the continual evolution of how we budget and how we go from a confederation to a unified campus, and how we budget, how we look forward to these. That's why I wanted the Gordian process to be up here in front of us, is it is so big and so daunting that if we don't get the baseline understanding amongst each other, I was afraid we'd all go at home and not be able to sleep and thinking that we're making progress. So the improvements on the budgeting that the Chancellor and Ryan are talking about, or the changes on how we do this and how we look at them going forward, is just nibbling at what we need to do. And I've told Glenn before, I had a niece and a nephew that one went to USM and one went to another school, and the way they arrived at their dorms and the way their parent called me that night to tell me about their experience does emphasize what the Chancellor said earlier. So we have a lot of room for improvement, a lot of work to do. But the great thing is looking around the room, we've got a lot of great minds to help us get there. Now we just need the dollars to feed the lines. The minds. Brian, anything else on Gordian?
Not on this topic, Mr. Chair.
All right. Can I just give Ryan an attaboy? The reality is we tricked the state and the community colleges in Maine Maritime into using Guardian. We knew that our position would benefit if everyone had to use the same measuring device. And so I give Ryan and Sam Warren as well, and our kickoff meeting about over a year ago with respect to what was required to be constituted of a committee working on this. But that was a major victory for us to be able to explain our position juxtaposed to others.
Thank you, Chancellor. It's great that when we have a benchmark that we're using, that we can use a similar yardstick to do it with. Any other questions or comments? And I think we'll slide into the next piece of our presentations this morning on the campus by campus budget. Ryan, do you want to kick us off and
Yeah. So just a scheduling note. In my conversation earlier with the chair, we kind of flipped the timing around for the facilities conversation. We did expect it would be a little bit longer, and I think the budget conversation a little bit shorter. So still tracking, largely tracking our schedule for this morning. So when we had originally talked about setting this meeting, one of the things that we thought we'd be able to do coming here on the 9th, a few weeks after the presentations, was to cover any additional changes that we had in the budget. Frankly, we don't have a lot. The campus has spent the early part of the calendar year on their campuses, working with their teams and put together some really strong budgets. And so I'm coming here today not with a huge amount of adjustments since the budgets that you just saw a couple of weeks ago. What I do want to spend a little bit of time about in our 20 minutes or 25 minutes that we have for this is covering two topics with the help of Vice Chancellor Placido. I want to talk first about the federal dollars, and they're obviously playing a huge role in balancing campus budgets, either in fiscal year 21 or fiscal year 22. And so I want to update the committee on those three buckets of federal resources and where we are with those. And then I want to come back to a question that came up at the March meeting, which my apologies for not anticipating, but several of the campuses in their budgets referenced their partnerships with academic partnerships. And so if you haven't been a trustee for several years, you might have been saying, what is AP? What does that stand for? How does that work? And so Vice Chancellor Placido has agreed to spend a few minutes talking about that partnership and where we are in that, and then happy to answer any questions on that. So let me start with the federal funding, and I'm going to share my screen, hopefully for the last time today. And I'll ask Sam Warren to jump in here where she wants to add anything. She's really been the kind of the key contact for us. So let me just start by noting these funds, first of all, are focused on institutional dollars. So when we've received these 3 rounds of resources, there have been institutional dollars, and then there have been dollars that have been meant for our students. And so I'm not going to spend time much time this morning talking about the student piece, other than acknowledging what we've talked about before, which is that in those cases where we've had student dollars come in, we've tried to get those back out to students as quickly as possible in a manner that is consistent with the guidance. And I think we've done that working with the presidents, working with the CBOs and the financial aid teams, quite frankly, as well as anyone in the country. So let me focus just a little bit on the institutional funds. So as I mentioned, again, 3 rounds of support, starting with CARES dollars, part 2, and then part 3. So the first version here, starting on the left, this was passed back in March 27, 2020, $9.3 million of institutional support to our campuses. This was obviously very early in the process. The focus of these dollars was to essentially reimburse campuses for costs associated with the significant change in the delivery of instruction. And so we had plenty of those costs early on in the pandemic. The big difference between this bucket versus the other 2 was we were not eligible to reimburse ourselves, if you will, for lost revenue. So when we sent students home early in last March. We weren't able to recoup, for instance, room and board revenue at that time. This shows you the original dollars. And then as of a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now, I guess, how much of those remaining dollars were left. The second round of support was the Coronavirus Response and Relief Act, passed in late December of 2020. About $23 million of institutional support. This was to cover expenses associated with coronavirus. And the big change here was the adding of including lost revenue. This is the vehicle that we will use to redirect a large portion of these dollars to help us balance out either FY21 or FY22 budgets. It is a very detailed process to document those losses. We are working with Sam, with Darla Reynolds and our accounting team to make sure we do that right, to make sure we do that in a consistent manner across the University of Maine system and not 8 different ways. You can imagine how much easier the audit process is when you've got a documented process and here's how we handled it on every campus. And we've already seen the benefits just on some of the audit conversations around the first round of CARES Act dollars. The third and most recent bucket is the American Rescue Plan, passed about a month ago, March 11th, 2021. It is consistent with the second package here, if you will. The allocations have not been finalized, as you'll note right here on the chart. These are what we call, the official term is SAM estimates. That is another roughly $26.5 million that will go out to campuses. You can see here in the final block over here, when I presented the FY21 budget forecast for you over a month ago on how campuses would resolve their FY21 budget gaps. It was largely through the use of federal resources. Want to stress again, makes absolute sense. I think we feel pretty comfortable. The majority of these losses here are one-time losses. They're specifically associated with coronavirus. They're associated with lower room occupancies. That means lower board. It means less ticket revenue coming in. All of those type of things. So we do think the one-time dollars lining up with one-time losses makes a lot of sense. The bulk of that we are using in 2021, about 24 million of it. You can see 75% of it here is specific to 2 campuses at Farmington and at the University of Maine. In 2022, we're using more buckets at Fort Kent, at Farmington, and at Presque Isle, another 3.5 million. It means that we have about 22 million left that has not been allocated. We do have quite a bit of time into FY23, I think it is, before, or calendar year 23, before all of the funds need to be spent. The bulk of this 22 million you can see is at USM and at UMA. In both cases, campuses used very little of these resources, if any, to close the 21 and 22 budgets. And so they'll have, excuse me, my mouse got away from me. They'll have a little bit more flexibility in using those dollars. Let me see if I can get rid of the screen share here. So I'll just close there and say that for those dollars that are left, that are not part of the budget resolution process that would come in front of you, either to close out 21 or the 22 budget. Campuses will be submitting plans into my office. Those will be reviewed by Sam Warren, by the folks in accounting, to make sure that they're compliant, to make sure they're consistent. We want to, working within the guidelines that we have, these are one-time dollars, and so we certainly want to make sure they're largely used for one-time purposes. And ideally, we'd like to direct as many of these dollars as we possibly can into facilities projects, whether that's HVAC projects or other projects that, again, fit within the guidelines that the federal government has given us. So we're working on some additional guidance that will be going out to the campuses early next week on the third round of funds, and then look forward to presenting more updates on the use of these dollars as we move forward with this committee. So let me see if Sam wants to clean up any of my mistakes there, and then again, we're happy to take any questions on the federal funds.
That was perfect, Ryan. I'm available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Any questions on either the use of the funds or leftover funds or anything that we can answer for the committee?
Any questions for the trustees?
Jim, I got.
Yep, go right ahead, Trustee Tate. And I didn't welcome you to your first committee meeting earlier. Ryan texted me on the side to remind me of my manners, but you weren't shy jumping in, so you got ahead of me. So go right ahead, Roger.
I feel very welcome. Thanks a lot. Again, another rookie question. What was the formula, Ryan, that determined the allocation of all this money between campuses?
Yeah, let me just shift that to Sam.
It's a great question. So to be very clear, the formula was set in the legislation itself, and it took into account the percentage of full-time students you had, the percentage of headcount you had, and was heavily weighted towards Pell eligibility, which served some of our campuses like UMA, for example, very well. Even though they have a lot lower FTE, they have headcount and high Pell eligibility. So that was the formula. And then the two, we call them CARES 2 and CARES 3, even though those aren't actually the names, but easy to refer to them that way. They also took into account a small percentage of your allocation was based on the percentage of students who were entirely online and getting those students resources as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions of trustees? And we're not all on one screen, so if I don't see your hand wave, please don't be shy and speak up. We're on two screens on my computer. I'll just add that some of the comments that Trustee Kane made about flexibility and ability, those of us former budgeteers always like to be able to reach into one bucket to solve for another. But I see this as one way where we're doing that and doing long-term good for the campuses, and we're kind of having some flexibility in the way we budget, but keeping it in capital account and keeping compliance with the different rules around the budget. So I want to give another shout out to the finance and facilities teams for finding ways to do more with what we have and still allocate them the way that was said. And I've never heard Sam be so very brief. Tim, do you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to converse with Ryan. I've always worried when we receive government funds like this for the funding cliff that could come later. But at the end of his comment, he made a comment about one-time purchases. This is very similar to what public schools are going through with amazing amount of dollars, and we are looking for one-time purchases. And I can only hope that we can put some of this into campuses to provide more space for learning around a COVID world. So But the funding cliff always worries me, but one-time purchase is the best way to do this, and Ryan did answer that at the end. And my second question, Sam just answered, it was around how did you divvy up between campuses? It was very similar to the public schools too with Title I funds. And so good job with that. Just it's always good to get government money, but at the end of it, it could be very dangerous financially too. So thank you.
And Trustee Yoke, that's exactly some of the conversation that little that Ryan and his team have had, and that I've had with Ryan about doing some matching principle here, so that you weren't one of the tricks that they used to do back in the day before they were really good at budgeting legislatures. They would start something last month of the fiscal year, so it would have a big fiscal note, but it would have a big tail on it. And sometimes that's what happens with these one-time funds. Things get started without a funding source going forward. But using these one-time funds to catch us up on some of our Gordian report or some other things really, I think, helps advance the cause and maybe not cause us more problems in the future, but maybe save us from more Preble Halls in the future. So again, shout out to Ryan, Facilities Student Shipping Group, for finding that flexibility to do as much good as we could with what we have that's not ongoing revenue. Any other questions or comments?
Mr. Chair, could I
Yes.
just mention just before we shift over to AP, and I meant to do this at the very beginning, but really just wanted to publicly thank our congressional delegation, not just because at the end of the day they may have voted for it, but because they were so engaged in the process, and staff spent a lot of time working with Sam and asking really good questions and understanding this, and then being advocates for it. So just want to make sure that we had at least publicly acknowledged the great support from our delegation.
Right. Any other last comments before we shift into campus by campus? Seeing and hearing none. First up to bat, we have University of Maine, Fort Kent. Pam Ashby is representing the campus today, and she's the Chief Business Officer. Welcome, Pam.
Mr. Chair, I think we had everyone here from the campuses, but it was only if there were specific questions from members about any of the specific budgets. Otherwise, I think we were going to shift to Robert covering answering the questions around AP and then potentially an executive session.
No, you are right. It's one of the errors that the chair had in not throwing away old agendas. So that was the 26th annotated agenda. So I apologize for that. Ryan, next up we have Robert.
Yep. Good morning, everyone.
Sorry about that, Pam.
I'll follow the lead of most popular presentations with this statement. I'll make this short. The University of Maine system sought proposals in 2017 for products and services to expand our national reach and responsiveness through online offerings, particularly for working adults. The expectation of these services included market research, effective marketing strategies, lead generation, instructional design support, subject matter expertise, student performance tracking, general management support, and some others. An RFP was posted and subsequently awarded to a company named Academic Partnerships, and that's where we get the acronym we refer to as AP. The AP initiative helped us accelerate our learning curve to provide modern, accelerated online learning to working adults. The AP team guided us through a series of improvement projects. No detail is too small on this because we were introducing an entirely new academic calendar. We had to start to rethink many traditional practices. We began by aligning our financial aid and bursar calendars for 6 start dates, 7 week sessions. That change caused us to have to reconsider things like the definition of student, part-time and full-time. I mean, this is the kind of detail we got down to. We had to add online student services like online orientations, and of course, AP helped with that. Reviewed all of our procedures and gave us various recommendations. For example, they helped to decrease our processing time of admissions, which we have all talked about over the years. And at the time, some of the programs we worked with, their admissions cycles were months on average, and we have brought that down to days. So working together, we reviewed every aspect of student contact and onboarding for online students. There were many steps that were that we currently had at the time were manual, paper-based, and some required students to come in, which is counter to being online and attracting students from other states. We implemented and invented new electronic processes from the beginning of the student journey with electronic acceptance letters to the end of the journey, adding electronic intent to graduate forms. AP committed time and money up front to help us reinvent some of our programs with no out-of-pocket except from us, except our time, which is not insignificant for sure. The agreement was to pay them back by revenue sharing. The agreement offered an excellent value and little risk. I say little risk because unlike other P3 agreements, if we didn't see the enrollment gains we expected, we wouldn't pay. In addition to the money and time AP spent in the beginning, they continue to provide a significant amount of resources and money for these programs. AP pays to market the programs. They staff a large call center to rapidly respond to students. Once leads are generated, AP continues to maintain contact with the students until they are matriculated and beyond. Of our nearly 600 undergrad and graduate degrees and minors, we partnered with AP to provide an accelerated online option for 26 programs and concentrations, 18 at USM, 1 at UMFK, and 7 at UMPI. For our part, we received a tremendous boost in knowledge and process improvement. We also continue to receive a great amount of ongoing marketing and recruiting support. We had a disappointing first year, to be honest. The chancellor made it clear when he first arrived that this partnership had to turn around. This past year, all of our partnered accelerated programs have begun to improve. For example, UMFK doubled the amount of nurses in their program. We are unsure of the impact that COVID will have on these programs, but we expect that they will continue to grow rapidly in the future. I'll show you an enrollment graph here in just a minute. My wish is that you take away 3 points today. Point 1, AP added initial value and continues to work for their share of revenue. AP and UMS share in each other's success in a true collaboration. Point 2, we only partnered with AP for a handful of programs. AP does not share in any of the nearly 100 programs and minors we offer online. Point 3, these accelerated online programs that include 6 start times per year are distinctly different than our traditional online programs that we have so many of that have 16-week terms in fall and spring. And I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Quickly. This is where my hope comes from in terms of our growth. This is enrollment growth starting from when enrollment opens until the beginning of fall semester. The golden line at the bottom was our first year, as I said, was disappointing. The red line was last year, our growth, and the black line is the start of this year. You can see that we have reason to be optimistic about this. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Any questions for Vice Chancellor Placido?
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Yeah, President Cummings, please.
I just wanted to share that we have 18 programs now under the AP, and I would agree with Vice Chancellor's assessment that it was a little unclear whether it was going to be a productive partnership in the first year, but we have seen enormous growth in our graduate programs, particularly around educational leadership, counseling, et cetera, and now in nursing as well, both undergraduate and graduate, we anticipate as well. So our strong numbers in graduate programming right now are in great part a result of this partnership. And we have also learned a number of things about the market, particularly their focus on 7-week courses that are more accessible, particularly to adult learners. That has helped us refocus some other non-AP classes and being able to use that as a model. So glad to talk more about that, but I just wanted to echo from a kind of on the ground point of view of how this is affecting our overall enrollment.
Thank you, President Cummings. Any other questions or comments? Seeing and hearing none.
Chair, can I just say, Chair, it's Dan Malloy. Can I just say one quick thing? I want to give Robert a lot of credit. When I arrived, the program was in trouble. He went after the AP folks. I went after him. We brought him up. He visited him in Texas. I brought him up to the office, and the rapid turnaround, I think, quite frankly, exceeded our expectations as we began that frank discussions that were needed to be had with AP. And I think Robert did an outstanding job, and I just want to share that with you.
Thank you, Chancellor Malloy. We're in sync today. I was just about to ask you if you had any final comments you wanted to make, or if Ryan did before we move to our next item. Ryan, any wrap up?
No, I think if there are no additional questions, I think we're good with our presentations for this morning.
Okay. Thank you. Now we'll move into our executive session. And I'm just going to do our little reading. We'll move it to for the motion. Could I have a motion for the Finance, Facilities, and Technology Committee of the Board of Trustees to go into executive session under the provision of 1 MRSA Section 405(6)(c) to discuss the condition, acquisition, or disposition of real property or economic development if premature disclosure of the information would prejudice the competition or bargaining position of the University of Maine system. So we have that motion.
Moved.
Moved, and do we have a second?
Second.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
I did, again, Roger Cates here. I'm not a member of this committee. Am I correct that I would not participate in that executive session?
Trustee
Roger, go ahead.
Sorry, Trustee Cates, you will be joining us for executive session.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, we're not letting you out that easy.
All right, all right. Thanks.
Nice try. So we have moved in second. Ellen, would you call the roll?
Before I call the roll, I'll just have Heather explain how we move into executive session for the folks that are joining us in a virtual environment for the first time.
Hi, this is for the benefit of the new trustees who have not done this before. So what's going to happen is after Ellen takes roll call, I'm going to send a message across your screen to have you move to a breakout room. Just go ahead and click OK, move to the breakout room, and it will bring you right over. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Trustee Kane.
Yes.
Trustee Doak. Trustee Donnelly.
Yes.
Trustee Gardner.
Yes.
Trustee McMahon.
Yeah. Yes.
Trustee Martin.
Yes.
Trustee Riley.
Yes.
Trustee Rotundo.
Yes.
And Trustee Doak.
Yes.
The motion is carried.
Thank you.